Okay, let's take a look at something else that's related to energy and biomass in food chains, and it's the processes of biomagnification and bioaccumulation, which are negative impacts on ecosystems. And let's start with considering what the main idea we're looking at here. So we're going to look at the idea that non-biodegradable pollutants, such as PCBs, DDT and mercury cause changes to ecosystems through the process of bioaccumulation and biomagnification. So let's start with bioaccumulation. And bioaccumulation can be defined as persistent and non-biodegradable pollutants that cannot be broken down. They do not get synthesized inside the tissue of the bodies. They don't get metabolized out of the bodies. They just build up. So they can build up in tissues, organs, and cells of organisms. And a classic example of that is peregrine falcons. So, following the Second World War in the 1940s, the Green Revolution started, and the use of artificial pesticides became much more prevalent. The use of chemical pesticides to kill insects that would decimate harvests in some years. And that became very normal from the end of the 1940s onwards. However, by about the 1960s, worries were starting to be raised about the effect of DDT. DDT was the pesticide of choice in most of Europe and across North America. And Rachel Carson's book, for instance, Silent Spring, is really about the impact of these pesticides on the environment. In the UK, it was noticed that peregrine falcon numbers had fallen, and peregrine falcons they're an emblemic organism of the north and the west of the United Kingdom. And really before the 1930s, the population had been really stable at around about 820 pairs every year, breeding pairs. And breeding pairs is important because the population, as we've seen before, was controlled almost entirely by the number of nest sites available. By about the 1960s, there were just under 400 pairs. And questions started being raised about why this was happening. And ornithologists had started noticing that there were a lot of broken eggshells that didn't produce chicks in peregrine falcon nests. And so there was obviously something happening here. And a researcher called Derek Radcliffe demonstrated that the use of DDT was causing the eggshells to thin. He picked up DDT actually in the eggshells and proved that it was the DDT that was causing this to thin. And this resulted in fewer young every year. Yeah. And his thought processes on this was, well, he'd asked the question, how does DDT get into the system? How are peregrine falcons getting DDT? And he looked at the food chain, and what he theorized and then looked at and then went and examined each of these organisms was that DDT being sprayed on grain crops was being eaten by mice and voles. These make up the main feed of peregrine falcons. And he realized that the DDT was building up, it was bioaccumulating in each organism. But particularly in the peregrine falcon, year after year there was a build-up of DDT in the fatty tissues of the peregrine falcon. And after laying their eggs, what was happening was when the eggs were being sat on by the mother to keep them warm, the shells cracked. And obviously they were being weakened. So that was an example of bioaccumulation where the amount of the particular toxin, in this case DDT, was being passed along the food chain, but it also built up year after year because it couldn't be synthesized. It stayed inside the fatty tissue of the peregrine until the concentration was enough that it would actually start having a metabolism effect. Yeah, it would actually start affecting the ability to produce good quality, strong eggshells. So we're going to have a look at another example, and this is an interesting one. This is a human example. Most people know about the Mad Hatter in Alice in Wonderland. And the reason the Hatter was mad was because mercury was used in making top hats, and mercury is exceptionally poisonous. So hat makers in the 19th century would absorb mercury through their skin, and it would affect their brains. Yeah, so these pollutants, a lot of them are lipophilic, and they tend to attach to fatty tissue, and the brain is a big fatty body, and so hatters would go mad because of the effect of mercury affecting their brain function. It would alter the way that their brains worked. Okay, let's take a look at biomagnification, because bioaccumulation and biomagnification are linked. So, biomagnification is the increase in concentration of a persistent or non-biodegradable pollutant along the food chain. Okay, the way this works is that small quantities at the start of the food chain get passed on in numbers and build up to much higher quantities, much higher concentrations at the end of the food chain, particularly apex predators. So in the Arctic food chain, lichen absorb these pollutants, especially PCBs. They absorb PCBs and other things called persistent organic pesticides that stay, or persistent organic pollutants that stay in the atmosphere and stay in the environment for a long time. They have something called a long residence time. So the lichen absorb a small amount of these organic pollutants. That gets passed on to the reindeer, but the reindeer, as we've seen, needs to eat lots and lots, a lot of biomass to survive. So the quantity, the concentration of the pollutant in the reindeer fatty tissue increases. And then the wolf needs to eat a lot of reindeer meat to give it the energy to continue. And so we get this effect being passed on along the food chain. So, Canadian researchers have found that even small quantities of these persistent organic pollutants, especially PCBs, increase dramatically in concentrations up the lichen, caribou and wolf food chain. They're absorbed in small amounts. The caribou eats large amounts of lichen, and so it accumulates these POPs. And the wolf eats large amounts of caribou meat, so it accumulates and magnifies again. So not only is it being passed up the food chain and the quantity increasing because of the amount of biomass, the magnification aspect of it, we also get bioaccumulation because they stay in the fatty tissue. So the wolf over time builds up even higher concentrations. So we have accumulation along the food chain through biomagnification is due to the decrease in biomass and energy at each level. We've seen this before. So we've got a pyramid of biomass, and we know that the biomass of the wolf is much, much smaller than biomass of the producers. But the concentration of these POPs at each trophic level is basically a mirror. Yeah. So not only do we get this biomagnification, we also get bioaccumulation. And again, let's have a look at an example in humans. So Minamata Bay is a famous example of this, and it helped change the history of the environmental movement. And so that links back quite nicely with topic 1. Minamata is a small factory town in Japan, and it was dominated by one factory, the Chizo factory. Chizo made petrochemical-based substances from fertilizers to plastic, and they used a lot of mercury in these processes. Between 1932 and 1968, Chizo dumped around about 27 tons of mercury to Minamata Bay. Beginning in the 1950s, thousands of people started suffering from mercury poisoning. Mercury poisoning is quite a debilitating effect, and it's worth looking up what it actually does to the body. So, how did this happen? Well, the biomagnification of it. So some bacteria, algae, change this mercury into a modified form called methyl mercury. Methyl mercury is absorbed into the bodies of small organisms such as shrimp. When the shrimp are eaten by fish, the methyl mercury enters the fish, and it doesn't break down. It gets stored in the fatty tissue of the fish. And then fishermen come along and fish the fish out, and we get this methyl mercury building up in the fatty tissue of humans. And so we've got the biomagnification starting off from small amounts, but over time, the amount of methyl mercury built up directly in the humans until mercury poisoning started. Yeah, and so it's quite a famous case of biomagnification and bioaccumulation together. The two are very rarely separated from each other. Okay, so within that, some work cited. Lewis Carroll, obviously. Most people don't realize that the Mad Hatter was mad because of bioaccumulation. And Derek Radcliffe's work is there. You can find copies of it on the internet. And there's a really nice set of resources and work about bioaccumulation and biomagnification in polar bears. Yeah. Okay, thanks a lot.